And today in the spotlight is our systematic literature review Mooc. And today we have Dr. Ken Monaghan and Peter Lynch, who both wrote and delivered the course. So over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So today we're just going to give a little introduction into systematic literature reviews, and meta-analysis are usually part for the Mooc we're going to be running. And yeah, so again, we'll just kind of talk about what they are, why they're important, and again, what the Mooc will be that we're offering. So first slide here. So first of all, the reason it's to do with research, we even look at systematic literature reviews is because of documents such as this that you see in the background. It's called Evidence, Policy and Impact. And that came from the World Health Organization last year, that it is about, basically it's a guide for evidence-informed decision-making, that it's trying to tell people that, you know, to make the best decision possible, we need evidence. So again, the definition there is evidence-informed decision-making, emphasizes that decisions should be informed by the best available evidence from research. It is a systematic and transparent approach that applies structured and replicable methods to identify, appraise, and make use of evidence across decision-making processes. So essentially, that is, again, telling us that the way we make decisions, it should be transparent and clear that others afterwards can see why, and they could repeat it. So again, in research, there's two key types of research. There's primary and secondary. So primary research over here would be, again, you collect your own participants. So you might have a study of 20 participants, you investigate each one of them, you collect your data, and you publish a report, and that would be primary data. Secondary research would be, it's called research of research. So essentially, that is collecting all the available primary research, pulling it together to give more of a definitive answer. So a little scenario I like to think of for that is, I'm a chartered physiotherapist myself, and I work in a clinic. So when it comes to different treatment options for different conditions, I could go on to databases and find by a Monday, if I'm treating a frozen shoulder, a paper might say, this is X, Y, or Z is the best treatment for frozen shoulder. And by the end of the week or the following week, I could go back in and there's a new treatment being suggested by a different author saying, no, this is the best treatment for frozen shoulder. So a systematic review basically combines all the relevant research and it brings it together to give one definitive answer. So it helps clinicians like myself to make a decision. You could say to a patient, this is why I'm doing this treatment, because the evidence says this is the best one. So that is the reason we do secondary research. So why systematic literature reviews for the Mooc? So we're saying, again, a systematic literature review is a review of evidence on a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and explicit methods to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant primary research and to extract and analyze data from the studies. So comparing that to the opening slide from the World Health Organization, you can see there's a lot of crossover between the definition for evidence-informed decision-making and systematic literature reviews. So it really does help to answer research questions we have, because again, it collects primary research, brings them together, appraises each one to give you a sort of idea of how good or bad quality research is, and it gives you a definitive answer. So it helps with evidence-informed decision-making. Where statistical analysis is required, this will usually include a meta-analysis. So a lot of systematic literature reviews will also include a meta-analysis, because again, systematic literature review brings together sort of data and information, whereas meta-analysis is more statistical, so it works with numbers. So a meta-analysis, it is a statistical method to combine results from relevant studies to efficiently integrate existing information and provide data for rational decision making. So again, larger sample sizes increases the reliability of results. So I just have a little diagram here. So this you will often see is called a forest plot. So you'll see this in almost every meta-analysis. It's the most commonly used form of statistical analysis. So you just have a little there description of each of how to read and interpret a forest plot. So the line in the middle, the vertical line, it represents sort of the line of no effect is what we call. So if we imagine on the right-hand side, this is our new intervention. So anything coming over to the right proves that our new intervention is more beneficial than the control it's based against in each study. And then if we go imagine to the left-hand side, it's vice versa, that the control is better than the actual intervention that is being tested against. If the lines that we see in the middle, so the square of each is the kind of estimate. Again, the larger the square, it means it's the larger sample size. So it kind of has more weight in determining the overall result. The lines that go through the square are called confidence intervals. So again, if results aren't spread out as much, the confidence interval there will be smaller. So the spread of data will be smaller and it's a better and more convenient result. Whereas if they're wider, it means there's a larger spread of data and the results are a little bit more skewed. If the confidence interval or the square crosses the line in the middle, that is what we call, again, the line of no effect. So that means there's no real definitive way of saying one is better than the other. It might lean one side, but it's not definitive. And the triangle and the diamond at the very bottom is, again, is the accumulation of all the results. So for this example, if just say the intervention was on the left, for argument's sake, this is proven that the intervention is statistically more significant versus the controls because it's on the intervention side and it doesn't cross the line of no effect. Okay, moving on. So pulling together systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So this little guy here is throwing all this information from all these different studies. And what that gives us is it's new knowledge and understanding. Again, from each individual study would have their own new knowledge and understanding, but bringing them together is different again, and it gives a new outlook. It gives us new recommendations based on the findings. So again, for example, if you were doing a systematic review to produce clinical guidelines, you would again find the most effective sort of criterion guidelines from each study, get an average, and you could give your recommendations based on this. So for argument's sake, if it was to do with walking, you could give, you know, an average of the minutes per day, the weeks, and you could give that as your recommendation based on your findings. Gaps in research. So again, you could find from, for argument's sake, if you had 15 studies in your review, that you identify certain areas that aren't investigated thoroughly in your systematic review that your meta-analysis doesn't cover, and then you can get your crossover and you can suggest going forward what new studies can do, and just like that, it informs and guides future research and future studies. So just here I have, this was within the WHO document as well. There's just 7 principles behind systematic literature reviews, behind doing them. So transparency, again, is to be very clear in what you're doing. Clarity, same. It's just to show that it's repeatable, that someone could come along, take the steps of your methodology, and they could do it again. And again, integration, focus, equality, accessibility, and coverage. This little checklist I have here on the right, so this comes from what is called Prisma. So Prisma means the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So every systematic review is supposed to follow a structured process. So again, transparency and clarity, you should say how you did your review and what sort of structure you followed. So Prisma is the most commonly used checklist that gives you that structure that you follow, that you tick the box to say, I've hit each step along the way of writing my systematic review, and that someone can come along and they can follow the same process. It just, again, it's the most reliably and used checklist. So once you use it in your review and you've checked each item on the list, it goes to clarify that you cover your aspects of the principles of a review. So coming on to the Mooc now, we ran last summer a workshop on systematic literature reviews and meta-analysis. So the feedback we got from that led us to seek to do the Mooc. So some of the feedback we got, again, after we decided we were going to try and take it further at the time, that I'm delighted to see you taking this further. The step-by-step process made me realize a systematic review is not as complicated and as daunting as I first thought. And the learning material is great, but being able to ask questions really helped me to understand the whole process. And it would be great if there's practical examples for each stage of the process. So we took each of these feedback on board to try and structure the Mooc. So at the minute, so we have it on Moodle that the Mooc page is actually live, well, up and running now, but we have to add our material, which we're pulling together now, and we will structure in the coming weeks. So that is what it will look like, but again, there's going to be a lot of different additions in the next couple of weeks, and it is going to be done in a way that takes us through a bit of a process like this. So we, based on the feedback we got, are going to try and design the Mooc that we could say stage 1, week 1 if you want, that each week or each stage has a very specific view of what we're going to do for that one. So it's going to be based on the idea that we're taking someone from, they want to write a systematic review, where do they start? So they click stage 1 and then they follow stage 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Stage 1 will be based on, should we say, condensing the focus area. So someone has a broad idea of what they want to write a review on, but more often than not, we find to have to condense the area because either A, there will be a review already written, or you find there's very, very focused or detailed studies that if you don't condense it down, your review will be much, much too large to handle. So we do something at that stage called a scoping review, which helps us to get an idea of the sort of density of research and volume that's out there, and that helps us to really narrow in on our idea. So once we have a better idea of what we want to look at, the volume of research there, then we can develop what's called a research question. And the literature review is based on trying to answer that research question. So following that, the next stage in a linear pattern would be developing your search strategy. And something here that's called Pico. So Pico, again, that comes from, it's called Cochrane, which is the most commonly used, is where Prisma comes from too. It's just an organization where it's based on a lot of the evidence that there is crossover between a lot of these. But Pico means population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. So what that is essentially, if you developed a table and you had 4 columns for your PICO, you would then put in all the search terms you could think of, the most relevant terms for each of those, and that becomes your search strategy. So for example, say population. If my population was stroke patients, we might have one search term is stroke. Another search term might be cerebrovascular accident. Another one might be TVA, because there's a few different ways, and different countries have different terms and terminology for each of these conditions and populations. So this is trying to cover all that you can find, and your scoping review again will help with some of the terminology. And then the way you would use your search strategy would be, you would have your terms for your P for your population, and you would combine it with your terms for your intervention, combined with your comparison and your outcome, and that becomes your search strategy. And very quickly, it's a very, very specific search strategy that will turn up a number of manageable papers and articles that become what we call your database yield. So then you go through each of the articles. Number 3, stage 3, would then again database search. So you'd be using your search strategy, and again there's something called grey literature, which again we won't go into too much detail now, but usually you'd go through, we would say on average, about 4 databases and what we call the grey literature, and that gives you your basis for your review, where you find your material. Stage 4 would be, again, so you have, for example, say 200 articles yielded from your search. You then would describe and give justification for your inclusion or exclusion of each of the papers. And again, more often than not, you might actually at this stage even condense your research question even more if you find that you can be even more specific. So you might end up, in an ideal world, we say, for a systematic review to be very specific and very, very thorough, we would ideally have within 5 to 15 papers. So you find very quickly that you have to condense your research questions more and more. At this stage 2, we do something called a critical appraisal. So this essentially means that you're judging the sort of quality of each of the studies that are included. There are a lot of templates out there to help with this. So again, once you get to this stage, on the Mooc, we will have links to each of the templates that help with doing this. And again, it's just more of a tick the box exercise. That does it meet the criteria, and then you give it a little bit of a score to say the quality of the paper. And then data extraction. So this is usually done in the form of a table. So again, you're just given your information, such as the aim of the study, the sort of methodology, participants, results, limitations, all that sort of stuff usually goes into a data extraction table. And finally, on the Mooc again, we will have a little slot for doing your statistical analysis and reporting your findings. So statistical analysis, the part of the meta-analysis we were talking about earlier, is more often than not done on something called RevMan, which is short for Review Manager, and it is software that is designed for doing meta-analysis, so that it really produces, as we were showing earlier, the forest plot. So that's usually where you get your forest plot from. You'll input your results, which is usually they look for some sort of mean value, so an average value of a certain outcome you were looking at. They look for the amount of participants, and they look for the year. So again, the amount of participants helps to determine the sample size, which we seen earlier. Larger sample sizes give more weight and are more meaningful in a systematic review and meta-analysis. And what's not there is all the time we'll have a little forum for question and answers, so that if someone, when they're going through the process of writing the review and going through the stages, if they have any questions along the way, myself or Ken will be able to answer questions and try to make life a bit easier once they're going through it. So that is just a couple of references that we had for writing this presentation. So that's me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's brilliant.